I would like to apologize for the unusual format of my participation in the conference. I am really sorry that I was unable to come and be there present in person as planned at this wonderful event. Professor Sanhi, I hope you are listening, and I would like to thank you because you played a key role in my academic career, and you continue to be my inspiration, my mentor, and you provide me with moral support when I need it. I cannot thank you enough, and I hope we can meet soon, either in the United States or in Europe. I would also like to thank my other teachers at Clark. I know that Professor Vo is there as a chair of my session, and I'd like to thank her for her wonderful courses and conversations. And in general, I would like to say that I remember my years at Clark, both as a teaching assistant and as a May student, as intensely vigorous in intellectual terms. And this was also due to this open communication between the teachers and peers. Later on, when I was a student at bigger universities, I attended after Clark. I don't think I enjoyed the same level of engagement among teaching staff and students, and this made the transmission of learning a little bit less personal. Therefore, I truly missed the English department's ambience, and I was looking forward to feel it once more again. Unfortunately, due to Brexit, the processing times of travel documents for European scholars in the UK for my entry clearance to come back to the UK have been delayed. Things are a little bit tricky for European scholars in the UK in general, and especially those who have connections to Russia. So sadly, I've learned this last minute that I was not and wasn't able to travel. And this is particularly ironic because my presentation is about traveling scholars, albeit medieval ones. Nevertheless, I cherish this opportunity to share my work with you in this unusual format, and I do hope that you find it interesting. Thank you in advance. Today's presentation is a fragment of a larger project sponsored by Marie Curie Fellowship to enable me to conduct research in archives in Seville and Madrid in Spain. I will focus on a few characters who contributed to the intellectual history of Europe and the history of English literature. The Peripatetic school of philosophy was born in ancient Greece. Aristotle is considered to be its founder. The school's name is based on a legend that Aristotle was fond of walking about while teaching, either in a garden or in the Lyceum where he taught. Raphael's fresco right here depicts Plato and Aristotle walking and talking in the school of Athens. Both Aristotle's pupils and ancient Greek commentators of his work were called Peripatetics. But the school itself ceased to exist in the 3rd century with the rise of the Neoplatonism and then the eventual decline of Rome. Neoplatonists did not discard Aristotle's teachings, but rather tried to incorporate it, and some of them wrote commentaries on Aristotle. Boëthius, best known for his Consolation of Philosophy, was one of them. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle's work on logic, and after him there are no significant advancement of the peripatetic tradition in the West. After the fall of Rome, the tradition was developed elsewhere and re-emerged in Europe in the 12th century. In 1927, an American medievalist, Charles Homer Haskins, published The Renaissance of the 12th Century and became one of the key scholars to point out that the Renaissance of the 15th century was not a massive paradigm shift. It had a precursor in the Middle Ages, which were far from being dark. As to the Peripatetic school, it appears that the peripatetic tradition was not only preserved but developed by the early Islamic philosophers. Averroes, above depicted in the fragment, being one of them. And in the 12th century, both Aristotle's texts and those of his commentators were translated from Arabic. Thus, the Peripatetic school re-emerged in the West. It was brought back to life by translators, traveling scholars, and writers. And today, I would like to mention a few of them, pointing out how their contribution influenced not only the European intellectual thought, but also the history of literature. Our first scholar, Petrus Alfonsi, or Moshe Sephardi, was a Jew from Spain who converted to Christianity in 1106. He came to England from his native Andalusia and translated many scientific works, astronomical tables. He translated from Arabic into Latin. At one point, he was employed as a physician to Henry I. In 1120s, he wrote the Letter to the Peripatetics of France in defense of the astronomical and astrological knowledge. A 12th century manuscript at the British Library contains this letter. It may have served as a preface to the astronomical tables that he also brought with him to England. And a manuscript with these is also found in Oxford. More importantly, Petrus Alfonsi authored the Disciplina Clericalis, a collection of fables from different traditions, Islamic, Indian, Christian. A medievalist Dorothy Mitlitsky claimed that this work was the first work that was modeled on the Eastern collection but written in the West. It brings more than Oriental stories and anecdotes, proverbs, and folklore from the East. It is based on different narrative structure and thus had an impact on storytelling in Europe. Moreover, Petrus Alfonsi was among those first scholars who brought the principles of experimental science to England, and he influenced another important English scholar, Adelard of Bath, in this respect. Judging by the tone of Petrus Alfonsi and Adelard, the new wave of knowledge was resisted in the 12th century, only to be totally embraced in the following centuries. So when Chaucer's Wife of Bath begins her story, she underscores experience and places it above authority. The respect to experience is already a commonplace in Chaucer's times, but it was advanced in the 12th century by a few people, like Petrus. Petrus promoted scientific experimental method and knowledge, which would eventually inform Chaucer's imageries and themes. The second scholar I wish to speak of is Daniel of Morley. Daniel was a justice to King Henry. In search for learning, he traveled first to Paris, where he found teachings unsatisfactory, and then he traveled to Spain, staying in Toledo. There he learned Arabic and started to translate from Arabic. Upon his return to England, he brought with him valuable manuscripts. His own work, Philosophia, did not add much new after Petrus and Adelard in terms of scientific knowledge, but it gives us a lively account of the Toledo school. After the conquest of Toledo in May 1085, the Armoria Arabum in the Mosque of Toledo, all those Arab texts, became accessible to European scholars, and something like the Lyceum was formed there. From Daniel, we learn how Gerard de Cremona lectured his students in Aristotelian fashion. Daniel wished to introduce reforms at the school of Northampton and met his spiritual father, the Bishop of Norwich, but he met him in Oxford. And a medievalist, Charles Burnet, suggests that those manuscripts Daniel brought with him from Toledo were influential exactly at that time when Oxford starts to take shape as a university. How can we tell that those manuscripts are from Spain and not other centers of translation from Arabic? Well, one way of telling are the numerals. Arabs adapted their numerals from the Indians, and these became widespread in Baghdad and the eastern part of the Islamic world. But what is now called Arab numerals are in fact its Spanish variant. These were called dust characters, or figure toledane, because they were associated with Toledo school. Sometimes they were called Mozarabic, since they appear in those scripts. In the slide, the figure indici are the lower set, while figure toledane is the upper set, with variant forms for 4, 5, and 6. Thus, we can be certain that the majority of English texts containing the new learning owe their origin to Spain, and Daniel of Morley contributed to this knowledge. Other traces are much more subtle than numerals. For example, upon analysis of these lines in this poem, The Owl and the Nightingale, which was written by an anonymous scholar, most likely a contemporary of Daniel, we can see the reflection of the new wave of knowledge. In the poem, there is an argument between two birds that touches on astrology, marriage, learning, and other aspects of life. But at one point, here in particular, the nightingale loses self control and describes the process. The process described here is based on Aristotle's theory of the heart. The turmoil in the heart is caused by anger, and this leads to the dullness in the head. And this is clearly based on the new understanding of the anatomy of the heart, which was introduced by medieval Peripatetics. The poem reflects ideas propagated by Alfred the Englishman, or Alfredus Anglicus, who wrote an original text on the movement of the heart. The main point of this text was to justify the Aristotelian position of making the heart the primary seat of the soul rather than the brain. The head-heart dichotomy becomes crucial, and it would have its reverberation in theological disputes, especially in respect to the mystical theology. It was also innovative because Alfred's the Englishman's philosophy of the soul was grounded in the anatomy and physiology of the heart, breathing, circulation, and not in speculations. By Chaucer's time, this too will become a commonplace. If we stretch the meaning of the term medieval peripatetics to include to those traveling writers who promoted Aristotle's ideas and facilitated transmission of new learning, then Chaucer can be considered to be one of them. And nowadays, many scholars turn their attention to Chaucer's connections to Spain. I wish to mention only one benefit from having visas and entry clearances. They are preserved as records of movement, and we have a proof, undeniable proof, that Chaucer entered Spain in 1366. Nevertheless, Spanish connection to Chaucer is very much resisted by quite a few medievalists. Just as Arabic influence on the intellectual and literary history of Europe causes heated debates. Sylvian Guggenheim's book that rejected Islamic influence on European thought was in the center of such a debate. Charles Burnett interjected by giving a lecture at Harvard at first, and then he published an e-article, which was an excellent defense of medieval scholars' contribution. In this article, he mentions a point raised by another scholar, a notion that cultures that do not translate or learn from others die out, and those who do flourish. I have heard this notion in my previous work on Lotman's semiotic. Crossing boundaries increases information. Translations and reading difficult text is a type of crossing boundaries, a type of movement. And in this respect, medieval peripatetics excelled. Like Charles Burnett, I do believe they contributed much to the European thought and literature in terms of subject matter and methods and propagation of new literary forms. I wish to end my presentation on a minor note on an article I came across a while ago in New Yorker, which reminded me of Aristotle and his school. The title of this article is Why Walking Helps Us Think. It mentions modern writers and most recent experimental studies that prove that walking is very good for our creativity. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention and apologize once again for not being there with you in person.